Here we are. I'm making a brew, and I've done it right this time. I won't say there's separate spoons for the wet and dry ingredients, but I think I've managed it all in the right order. Spot of milk. What could I have done wrong there? I don't know. It's one stop milk. Maybe they'll pick up on that.
You didn't put milk in first, did you?
No, not milk in first. Oh my goodness. Right, let's go and have a look at what we've been up to. So it's a bit of an exciting one all round at the minute. Actually, there's two cars which are reaching landmark stages. So the Mercedes 111 Kaiser II is at that stage where it's all just coming together. I've literally just put the front seats in now. We got the back seats and the carpets in for the final time a couple of days ago. We fired it up. I think that was just featured. We'd done that the day we filmed the last episode. You know, we've shuttled it back and forth on the transmission. We've done the diagnostics on the transmission and on the engine ECU. That all seems to be fine. I've tied up all the remaining loose ends on the wiring. So we're literally just getting everything in it for the last time so we can take it for a drive. So my plan was to try and get it in a position where I could just tootle it around the yard today. I've got a leak on the airbag on the back left, so I've just got to sort that out. But yeah, tomorrow would be in a position to drive it, and I'm hoping next week we'll be on with road tests. So yeah, it's a pretty special thing. I think the way the interiors all come together now, with all the little details, we kind of knew that they were already there and in line, and we knew how it was going to come together. Things like the stainless sill plates, these huge chrome trims that sit down the side. We haven't put them on until now because we didn't want to risk damaging them. But they're just a huge solid brass trim that runs the whole length and really just finishes off that bottom of the sill lovely. And then we've done this two-tone leather throughout, but various details have just come together, like the chrome trim on the door pocket, with the piping that we've put around this armrest here. All that just finishes off the sort of last details of it. Even the little Mercedes badge here, we've had these laser engraved, the leather laser engraved with the Mercedes badge. For those which, if you remember a previous episode, these were a custom-made piece we made in solid brass and chromed. They're originally just a sort of knurled plastic knob, which didn't really seem in keeping with the rest of it at all. Quite a lot of cool tech as well. I think I've showed people before things like the windows, which are electric windows operated off these cranks. And because all the electrics are controlled by a PDU, which is essentially an ECU that controls all the electrical systems on the car, that's allowed us to do a lot of pretty cool details. So automatic windows, I can do the other window. If I nudge this up and down, it puts the opposite window down, although it's already down, so it's not going down. We've also got a LCD rearview mirror, which is something we've not done before, but it was something that I've seen appearing on some high-end cars, and it makes a lot of sense because if you think of a normal rearview mirror, a lot of what you can see is the interior of the car, and you don't want to see the interior of the car in the mirror. So there's a little camera in the back window, and the mirror is an LCD screen, which when you flick the lever, the toggle on the bottom down, actually turns off and is just a normal mirror, so it's got a fail-safe on it. We've got a really nice old school looking head unit that's got a small screen which does sat-nav as well. And it's got modern climate control in it, which is the 4 large chrome knobs on the dash there. That was, again, another solid brass panel that we made and had chromed, which has got those knobs in. The actual system's a vintage air system. So it's just been really nice to see this all come together. We've just finished a few details in the engine bay. We've got panels on the engine covers now that say Kaiser, which is the name of the car. We've also had made a badge for the back, which is in the Mercedes font, but says Kaiser in the Mercedes font, which was beautifully machined by a friend of mine. So we'll show you that in a sec as well. The other thing, Stratos is totally on the countdown to starting it. It's been a long and complicated build in terms of the engine because of the complications of the supercharger, the charge cooling system. There's a lot of tech on it as well. It's fly-by-wire, particularly with there being such a long run from throttle pedal to throttle body. We wanted fly-by-wire rather than a cable, so you didn't get that dragginess of a long cable. And there's a lot of electronic technology. It's a Life Racing engine ECU, Life Racing PDU, Life Racing 9-inch screen on the dash, all of which ties together and talks to each other. So on Saturday, It's Thursday now. Chris from Northampton Motorsport is going to be coming over and doing the calibration work on the ECU, and hopefully, if we get this far, doing the first fire up. So we've been through all our kind of what I call pre-flight checks. So we've had the plugs out so we could spin it over freely, filled the oil, spun it over to get oil pressure, which all went pretty well. Filled it with fuel, purged the fuel system, checked that on a mechanical gauge. Likewise with the oil pressure, checked it with a mechanical gauge. So when Chris comes and gets the signals from the electronic sensors on it, we can just tally up that they all read correctly. And a lot of it is going to be just checking over sensors now electrically. So we've got a lot of sensors running on this. We've got an oil pressure sensor. We've got 3 temperature sensors, four in fact, one for oil temperature, one for the main engine coolant temperature, and then we've got the charge cooler circuit coolant temperature sensor, which is on a separate circuit with its own radiators. So 3 temperature sensors, sorry. And we've got 2 air temperature sensors, one for before the charge cooler and one after. The critical one there is the one after, which is what the engine will use to monitor its own incoming charge air temperature. The other one's more for our own curiosity to see how much temperature the charge cooler actually knocks out of the system. And then the coolant temp sensor on the charge cooler circuit is there, so if we decide we need some fans on the charge cooler radiators, which are mounted in the flanks here, we could use the engine ECU to switch those fans based on the coolant temp in the charge cooler circuit. It's running twin knock sensors, running a traditional coil pack. We couldn't uncoil on plug, but the access to the spark plugs is not this engine's strong suit, so it was decided to run an external coil pack there. Running twin wideband lambdas on it. It's also got 4 wheel speed sensors, which will be providing the information to the engine ECU. Now they will also give the dash its speed readout for the road speed, but we'll also use that information to give traction control, which we can control by a couple of potentiometers, which are going to go on the dash to give you variable settings on the traction control, so the level of permissible wheel slip and the aggression of cut. So yeah, a lot of technology, and hoping that Saturday is the culmination of a lot of hard work, and hopefully we'll see this fire up for the first time. Let's carry on and see what else we've been up to. I'm going to stop and have a brew. Normally what I do is just wander around with a cup in my hand, not drinking, but I've been beavering away on the seats in that Mercedes, and I've not had a drink for, I think I had a drink at lunchtime, which was about 4 hours ago. So let's go in here. So Stu has been on the Camaro. I think last week Nat showed you that he was working on panel gapping on this, which is now finished. So it was mainly lead work on the quarter panels and on the wings to just tighten in those panel gaps and get everything perfect. That's basically all done now. So he's now moved his focus onto the dash. We're doing some cosmetic changes to the dash. We actually did some renderings for this when we first started the project. We've modified the design slightly at this point, but there's still going to be a good amount of fabrication, predominantly in the central part of the dash, where the original radio and heater controls used to be. We're going to be putting a pair of dash vents in there because there were originally only vents at the side of the dash, so we're going to put a central pair in as well, so there's 4 vents on the dash. We're going to have modern air conditioning controls that are going in there as well, and a few other changes. And then we're also going to build a centre console in it, which has got a pair of auxiliary gauges in it. Obviously the shifter coming through, and audio controller, and a place to put your phone to charge it. But at the moment, Stu's working on the dash vents. So one of the things he's been working on are these really cool adapters that take the Audi vents that we've used, which are not really designed to mount in an aftermarket application, of course. They clip into a moulded part of the dash and are not really designed in any way to fit into a steel panel. So Stu's made these really clever little adapters that the vents slot into, and then they have a little wire clip that clips over to latch them in. And they then will be incorporated into the structure of the dash, which is metal anyway. So the vents will fit in from the front. You just click a wire and that's latched them in. So he's just moving forward with that, and he's going to start the fabrication of that central console panel next. Meanwhile, Scott and Nat have been on the Chevette. Good progress now. The sill, which I think the courier had taken on a tour of the Highlands and Islands on the way here, It's finally arrived. So we've got that sill in, which was the big remaining rot repair job, and also this reinforcer, because we were waiting on a new panel for there. He'd already done the majority of the other rot repair. There's a little section in the inner arch here. There's kind of a frilly edge where the inner arch panel comes down and meets the inner edge of the floor. And that had just gone quite crispy and frilly around the edge, so he's repaired that section there. Meanwhile, Nat's been on with the engine mounting. I can't remember last week whether we had the cross member in, but we basically stripped the cross member down, got that in so we could check clearance on the sump. The dummy engine that we're using at the moment has been fitted up with the dry sump pan and dry sump pump and bolted up to the bell housing and gearbox. And this week Nat's been designing the engine mounts. So all the components of those mounts he's drawn up on CAD. We've plasma cut them on our plasma cutting table. It's quite a clever design. He wanted to make it so it was bolt on. So if the cross member got damaged, it's just a standard Chevette cross member. So you haven't got to refabricate custom mounts into it. We've done what in escort circles they would call a World Cup mount, which uses, rather than a rubber bobbin with a stud top and bottom, it uses a round cotton reel type bush mounted longitudinally, and the engine mounts to the outer shell of that bush, and then you have essentially a clevis on the cross member with a bolt going through. And the beauty of that setup is just it's very fail-safe. Even if that rubber bush disintegrates completely, you've still got a bolt that's captured within a metal tube, which is why it was so popular in the escort rallying scene. Because of course, on a rally, those bushes are getting so much punishment, and then the last thing you want is an engine mount failing and your engine flapping around, because realistically, that's a stage, an ended stage. So I think that's a good bit of design. We are just starting the cage. That's the next step, really. There's a lot of things influenced by the position of the cage. We need to judge the seat positioning to get the seat mounts in, but we need to check clearance and the driving position to make sure there's no interference on headroom, that the seat wings don't hit the cage back here. So first thing to do is get the cage in, which they're just working on now. Nat's just fabricated up the main feet for the cage. They've got the main hoop resting in there. They've done some bracketry to gusset it onto the original seatbelt mounts up here. And they've just laid in the front legs as it stands. Now we're actually although we have made cages before and we have the facility to do so, we've started with a custom cage in this instance, because the cage that they do, they call it their Chevette historic spec cage. It's more or less exactly what we want anyway. So that we've decided to start with that cage as a good head start on it, and then do a few modifications of our own. So I think the next thing that's going to be working on is this cross member section here. He's done these cage feet here to have a flange that's flush with the front of the original chassis rail here. And then there's an extension piece, which I think he's just making at the moment, that gussets onto the front of this, these two trailing arm link boxes. And then that will then create a flat plane all the way across that this cross member he's going to design will then tie the whole lot together. So it'll add a lot of stiffness across the shell, but also tie the cage, the chassis leg and the trailing arm mount all together. So all of those sort of structural components are tied together. So that's looking really good. It's been one of those, the early phases on this car have almost been those frustrating phases where you're doing lots of little fiddly rot repair pieces, and it seems to take a very long time for not much visual change. And I think we're just getting into the bit now where there'll be a lot of visual change for not much time. So I'm really excited to see how this goes. Moving on. The Jensen, which I don't think Nat mentioned at all last week. I think when I'd last spoke about it, it was more or less in this state. It was stripped down. We'd got the body freed from the chassis, but we've left it on it for the minute just because it takes up less space with the body still on there, and we don't need it off for the work we're doing now. What we did, I think it was last week, we went to see a chap called Ron Clay, who introduced himself to us, and he seemed a very interesting character, had done a lot of work on CV8s, and seemed like a very useful guy to speak to. So we went over to see what he was up to, and he had various CV8 and Interceptor chassis in build. And he also shared our thinking that a good way to upgrade the front end of a CV8 would be to put the late interceptor front cross member on the chassis, because the chassis is very similar. The tubes are exactly the same. A lot of the floor sections are the same. There are differences in the parts that meet up with the body, and there are subtle differences elsewhere, but the fundamentals are the same on the interceptor and CV8. So we figured it would be possible to put an interceptor front cross member onto a CV8 chassis, and he backed that up. So what we are now doing to fast forward the project a little, and because we were very impressed with Ron's standard of work, Ron's building us a chassis which was already part finished, which will have the interceptor front end on it. It's also going to have, at the rear, they call it, I think he called it the chassis blade, but it's the section that comes up behind the sill and kicks up and over the axle and down to where the rear leaf spring shackle mounts here, and it ends about there. So it's the section that picks up all the load from the leaf spring. He showed us the specification of that same part from an interceptor convertible, and it was just a massively beefed up version of the same thing. So thicker gauge steel, lots of extra gusseting in it. And we figured that was actually would be a really good addition to beef up that area of the chassis for the independent back end mounting that we're going to do. So he's building us a chassis with the interceptor convertible rear blades and an interceptor front cross member, which will give us the much nicer later interceptor power steering setup. It gives us the shock towers. On these they had lever arm dampers, which are not really a great setup, whereas the later interceptors had a coil spring and damper arrangement, more or less a coilover you'd call it, although the spring doesn't actually sit onto the damper. It sits into a spring pan on the wishbones. And actually, it's a pretty decent setup. So that's the plan now. Ron's doing that. I think in another week or so, we should be able to pick up that chassis from him, which will give us a huge head start. Moving on from that, the other things we've been up to, we've been making some forward progress into the rear end. So our plan is to run a Jag-based independent rear end in it. The plan at the moment is a Series XJ cradle with the later XJS type outboard brake setup. So the Series XJs had a really nice self-contained cradle that the coilovers went into. It's pretty much a self-contained unit, but it had the inboard discs, which we weren't mad keen on. But you can mix and match the parts of the various eras of independent Jag rear end. So our plan at the moment is Series XJ with the later hub carriers, shafts and brake setup. They actually did a really nice brake setup on the latest XJSs, which had a big vented disc on the back. So that's the plan. So we've already got hold of a Series XJ rear end, which we've stripped down, ready to use as a mock-up unit. We are next week going to pick up an XJ40 back end, which will give us the hub carriers and other parts that we want for that. And that will be what we need to build our mock-up rear end, which when the chassis arrives will be one of the first things we look at doing. The only other thing we've been doing on that is stripping the paint off the fiberglass parts. That's gone really well, actually. It wasn't that well adhered, if I'm honest. I think it probably wasn't that well adhered from the factory. So there's a bit of elbow grease involved. We don't want to blast it, obviously, because it'll damage the fiberglass. We didn't want to use chemical stripper because we didn't want the risk of that soaking into the fiberglass and causing issues with the paint. So we're manually sanding it. And we're trying not to damage the original gel coat too much, so it's a little bit time consuming. But yeah, that's what we're doing. So we're hoping in the next couple of weeks we'll have a restored chassis that's got the fundamentals for the suspension setup we want to run, a mock-up rear end ready to go in, and the body panels all stripped back to their bare fiberglass state. And that'll be a great starting point for that. So that's that one. Last thing. I can see Jamie behind the camera starting to struggle holding it, so I better not take too much longer. Utah, we've been wet sanding the paintwork, ready to start the machine polishing on that. We've waited a bit because we want the paint to harden off a certain degree before we start doing that wet sanding process, because it sands a lot nicer when it's hardened for longer. So we should have that in the booth to polish that next week. And the other thing is the engine. We talked about we were going to do a nice, attractive, retro-looking plug lead setup on it, which Adam's been working on. So he's plasma cut a nice valley cover plate crackle black painted it, and then we've spec'd some grommets to sit into that, which are reminiscent of the old Ford BDA plug lead setup. And then we've got the plug leads coming out in pairs. We've made a custom set of leads for it. And then the final touch was we did some braided sleeving over them, which has it's black but with the odd fibre of white running through it, which just gives a little nod to that kind of woven cotton look that they had back in the day. And I'm really happy with how that engine's looking. It's just, you know, for such a modern engine, it's looking really cool and vintage. So really excited to get that together and see it in the car. That's it for this week. I'll see you next week. Bye.